Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, Planning a Transformative Information Strategy for 2020. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Vice President of Delivery from Mint, and Brian Vanetten, Solution Engineering Manager from AvePoint. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including Fed, SLED, and our private sector friends seeking knowledge and insight for leveraging Microsoft 365 to prepare for the new year. For folks who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, welcome. IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, the IQ Business Group has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors, that leverage people, process, and technology to support your requirements.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Ryan Britton. I work for an organization called the Mint Group, which is a global Microsoft partner with a 20-year history of success implementing Microsoft solutions on top of their products and services. We have a list of gold competencies. We work in highly regulated industries, and we're active in 5 territories, and pleased to be contributing on this webinar today.
And hello, everybody from Seattle. My name is Brian Vanetten, and I am a manager of the Solutions Engineering team based in Seattle. I've actually been at AvePoint now for almost 6 years, and AvePoint has actually been in the business, just like Mint Group, for well over 20 years, helping companies migrate, manage, and protect their SharePoint and M365 content by backing up, migrating, and governing those workloads, and helping organizations both in the public sector and commercial sector, and as well as heavily regulated industries, because we are a 5-time Partner of the Year award winner with Microsoft. We also have solutions in the FedRAMP space as well. So we are well aligned with the Mint Group and our partners here today to talk about 2022.
Perfect. So IQ, Mint, and AvePoint are here today to talk to you about topical stuff in the information governance space on the back of an effort that we all partake in, which is called Smart Compliance. And essentially, it is what we think is the innovating future of information governance and compliance strategies, incorporating best-of-breed products from AvePoint, consulting services focused on records management and information governance from the IQ stable, and implementing those on Microsoft technologies from a consulting perspective from Mint. The Smart Compliance framework has been created in the trenches and tested there as well over the last 5 or so years. Essentially, it is a set of methodologies and a framework for implementing information governance on top of the Microsoft 365 platform. It includes and is built on top of the governance and fantastic products that we receive from AvePoint, and is essentially it's stories from implementing these types of solutions for highly regulated industries and in public sector that forearms us with some good information that we can share on today's webinar.
So first up, we have a poll question. This is on your screens now. So we want to know a little bit about what your inefficiencies are. Where are your pain points? Okay, so consolidating data and reporting data are the big winners for this one. Not unsurprising, I think.
For sure.
Okay, so let's get stuck into our topic today. I'm really excited about, as this year draws to a close, having jam-packed a whole lot of useful information into today's talk that we would like our friends to walk away with as they prepare for 2022. I must say, Brian, that I'm a little bit worried that we may not be able to get through all the value that we've tried to pack in here. I think we may have to talk quite quickly to make sure that we get through it.
For sure.
At the end of the day, it'll be jam-packed full of value for anyone listening, so hopefully we can dive right in and get through it. We thought a good place to start would be a discussion about 2021 in review, and obviously looking at that through the lens of information governance. There's a lot of things that happened in the world this year, and a lot of them are trends that we've seen in previous years as well. Some of the things that we've highlighted on this slide, obviously there are continued pandemic-related issues, and we've seen that across the globe, and countries have been dealing with that with different levels of efficacy. We've seen the rise of remote working culture. We've even seen folks at the end of the pandemic, when required to return to work, refusing to do so, which we thought was very interesting, and we think it means a change for the way that folks work as a culture. Global data grew from 64 zettabytes to 79 zettabytes. Now, a zettabyte is so big that you can hardly even conceive of it, but that's a growth of 23% in a single year. It gives you an idea of how rapidly our information ecosystem across the globe is growing. There's also been a continued rise in cybercrime. There was a 300% increase in the USA since the pandemic, and that includes things like ransomware. Continued enforcement of information regulation. It seems that a week doesn't go past that we see high-profile cases of regulators levying fines against large organizations, highly publicized in the media, a lot of reputational damage. Amazon, WhatsApp, Vodafone. There was $10.4 billion levied against financial institutions alone this year. We've also seen that cloud adoption has continued to accelerate, and this is a trend that most of the organizations that analyze these trends have on their top 5 list. The movement to cloud and the hybrid environments that are springing up around them. And then finally, something that's really a buzzword and very topical and perhaps misused in some cases, but the rise of AI, augmenting our information workflows using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all sorts of smart things that come with the processing of data in ways that we wouldn't have been able to do 5 years ago. So quite a few things. Yeah. Sorry, Brian.
Sorry, and just to add to that too, the theme that you're seeing here as well, and I talk to dozens of customers a week and hundreds of customers a year. The consolidation of these conversations aren't just coming from IT, right? That we're actually having the business and our end customers really pushing for these concerns and for the organization that we all work for, that we are able to address these things up front, or that we have a strategy going forward. So these conversations are coming up regularly. It's not just in the news, it's actually being included in regular business transactions as well.
Absolutely. And hopefully as our listeners are going through these points, they're seeing ways that these forces would have influenced their businesses throughout this year as well. And perhaps they're reaching the end of the year tired as a result of these bullet points.
Definitely not a dull moment.
Yeah, exactly. I think you can go to the next slide, Mags.
Okay. Here we go.
All right, so looking back is one thing. Let's look forward. What are the things that we think that we can expect in 2022? In many cases, it's more of the same. And I'm sure that a lot of these points will resonate with you as well, Brian, and that you've got quite a few anecdotes that you can add here.
Yes.
The pandemic impact, we're expecting less of an impact. So as folks creep out of their hiding places and the shadow of COVID starts to pass, we anticipate that we will see an impact in the economy and in the information economy as a result of that. Now, the remote working culture will become embedded in many organizations and agencies, and we're seeing the start of folks reporting on this as we return to some kind of new normal. And the amount of data will, sorry, Brian, please.
One thing to add real quick to the remote working culture, something I experienced this year for the first time is that I hired whole teams remote for the first time, that I actually did training, did the creation of the positions, interviews, all these things were hired for remote first time inside of AvePoint, because we have offices in most major cities in the US and around the world. So it was really interesting to see how different that experience was for people. And I'm sure people in this conversation today also experience this as well. How do we go about, ensuring an inclusive work culture, but at the same time hiring people remote and building that trusting relationship too? That's definitely been something that's become increasingly normal here, and I definitely wanted to share that with the audience here today.
Yeah, our organization has an upcoming Christmas party, and we have little caricatures that are created for us that we use as our avatars and are on our coffee mugs. And I'm really hoping that some of the folks look like their caricatures, because it's really all I've seen of them.
Yeah, absolutely. But seeing the fully realized person is quite exciting when we're able to get back to that.
Yeah, exactly. So some other things we can expect: data is going to continue to grow at an exponential rate. And that means that any of the problems that we had from an information perspective today are going to probably be another 23% more of a problem to deal with at the end of next year. Likewise, cybercrime will continue to grow. Did you want to say something about the data growth, Brian?
Yeah, real quick, because just to add to, it's not just content, right? It's also the metadata underpinning said content, right? We're having a lot of conversations with customers about how to better inform the business about the content itself and what we can do to drive that strategy going forward to help make it sustainable. Because as you said, on the previous slide, zettabytes of data, more than 23% growth in a year, that is substantial, and that isn't going to stop, right? As more and more people come online and do more transactions remotely, it's one thing that we all have to consider is not just the data itself, but the metadata around it. And we'll definitely get more into that in later in the conversation.
Exactly. In true human form, it's not good enough that we have exponential growth of information. We have to have exponential growth of information about information.
Mm-hmm.
Cybercrime going to continue to grow. People are going to continue to try and take advantage of folks through social engineering, ransomware, these types of things, and it becomes ever more necessary for folks to protect their information. Information regulation is going to continue to become more draconian. Folks it's a top of mind thing, protection of folks' information. We're getting to a point where litigation against organizations that mismanage employee or customer information is becoming a reality. And there's a lot of liability in that for organizations that have to deal with information and data requests and all of these these ever more stringent regulations. And then cloud adoption will continue to gain more traction, but more organizations will become hybrid. And I think hybrid environments are going to be the order of the day for the foreseeable future as folks start to consume some cloud, but also try to sweat their assets from an on-premises perspective and get these two different landscapes to talk to one another. And then the need for clean, organized information to power machine learning will become more vital to business. So it's not good enough that we have a lot of information. We want that information to be valid, clean, relevant, discoverable, all of those good things.
And this is one I think that's super interesting that we're starting to see, Microsoft and other platforms like them really talk about how this can become practical as a part of the business process, right? Because I'm sure people have heard the buzzwords around machine learning over the last few years, and they've seen some tepid responses, but really it's actually here that we're now seeing actual business use cases and businesses, being able to derive valuable outputs from machine learning technology. So this will definitely be something exciting in 2022.
I agree. And then finally, for those folks who are in the US and are interact with NARA, M1921 will come into effect at the end of 2022, essentially meaning that NARA will stop accepting physical records and will only accept electronic records in terms of their submissions. And so a big year for anyone who needs to fall in line with that from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, that's huge. Finally, getting rid of physical items and going digital, that's going to be a massive game changer over the next year. So very excited to see what those changes bring.
Yeah. Okay, Maggie, I think we can move on. Okay, so this is just a summary of everything that we've seen in the last two slides, just to kind of level set it inside of our minds before we delve into some of the thoughts that we have about the coming year. So cloud adoption, hybrid work, and remote working culture will continue to fragment the information landscape. I think we can all see that as a thing that we're going to have to navigate in the coming future. the way that we work has changed forever. Information will continue to grow at an exponential rate. The size of information governance problems with the organization are likely to be 20 to 25% bigger at the end of next year, and much more expensive to fix. So fragmented work environments, much more information. On top of that, there's an increase in liability of ungoverned information to the organization, and custodianship and responsibility for that organization is no longer the purview of the federal government or highly regulated industries. It's really becoming pervasive through any organization. And then finally, it is clear that information is becoming the real currency of the modern economy. It is tightly tied to the value of an organization, worth spending vast amounts of money to store and protect, and is critical to the decision-making processes of the organization or agency. Yeah, let that settle in. All right, and that brings us to something that we cheekily thought we would share with our listeners, and that is what we think a great professional resolution for 2022 would be, and it's a mouthful. I resolve to transform our informational landscape in 2022, to bring our organization or agency up to global standards of governance and compliance, to set us up for years of security, productivity, and efficiency, and to reduce our risk and liability significantly, bringing us solidly into the modern age of information. So if you think that that is something worth tackling in 2022, we've given you the vision. You're welcome to take it and run with it.
Yeah, it's a lofty goal, but believe it or not, most of us are already starting to address this in one form or another. But like most New Year's resolutions, I like this concept here, even though there is a lot here to unpack, and we'll go into this in the tips in just a little bit. I think it's actually really good to help, come up with a resolution, and then the next steps, as we're going to be talking about this, is the planning behind it, right? Some of these things, as I mentioned, we're doing already, right? But we also have to start considering other things that are a challenge for the organization, or seeing where the shortfalls are, so we can advocate for responsibility inside of the business as well.
Exactly. I mean, to speak to our previous slide, if information is becoming the currency of business, really, you don't want to be without an accounting system for it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so we have another poll question. I am putting that up on your screens now. We want to know what you think we're going to see in the coming year. So what are you and your organization expecting to have to prepare for?
Some thought-provoking stuff.
Okay, most people have voted. A clear winner is organizations investing in compliance and information governance systems. So that's really promising.
Yeah, that's very interesting because
And
go ahead, Maggie. I'm sorry.
oh no, go ahead, go finish your thought.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting to hear from the audience here, and because we had this conversation with a lot of customers already about things are already, the horse is already at the barn, right? That we already have a footprint in 365 or other collaboration workloads. How do we go about putting the horse back in the barn, to continue with that metaphor, or how do we sustain the horse going forward, right? And those are definitely conversations we'll be having in some of our tips, but we can definitely follow up on more of that, because you're definitely not alone there. That you might have rules in a book someplace, or on a page on your intranet, but how do we go about making this enforceable and sustaining is definitely something every organization is challenged with.
Yeah, well said. And then 33% of people are expecting an expansion of regulation around privacy and information governance, which I think is a pretty safe bet.
Yeah,
For
that's
sure.
pretty inevitable.
That, and also just we're seeing case law finally come out with clarifications around what the law intends to mean, right? I know that there were quite a few cases in the European Union and even in the United States and Canada where the law, has been enacted, but now there are challenges to it to understand and clarify. So we'll definitely see quite a few case law adjudications come out in the next year that will help clarify how this impacts the business.
Yeah. Okay, and then that brings us to 10 tips for transforming your information landscape in 2022. It sounds like a few of them, but I promise you, you need to get your notepad out because we've dumped a ton of value inside of here from our own experiences, and we have a lot to get through. So without further ado, let's dive into it.
Indeed.
Tip number 1, don't wait for January 2022 to start. I think this is a pretty obvious one. The fact is that your environment is in a position right now where you can start to get information off of it, and you need that information in order to build a plan. And so don't wait for the beginning of next year to start to figure that stuff out. You want to hit the ground running when January starts. And so there are some things that you could do, such as assess your information landscape, really document what is where, why it's there, what complications there would be. Perform a security audit. Good to know what your standpoint is, and that's a good thing to do at the end of the year anyway, as you start to wrap up the year's activities. Map your information repositories. The first question that you're going to have to answer when you start to think about information governance and possibly cloud migration and a whole slew of things related to information and compliance is what your information, what type of repositories your information is sitting inside of. Review your retention schedule. We often deal with folks who have a retention schedule that's not necessarily been brought up to date with the latest regulations, simply because audits are, happen maybe annually, maybe not that often. And as a result of that, it may be slightly outdated. Evaluate your compliance standing, go through different compliance measurements and figure out what's important to your organization. Start to think about what you're aiming for in terms of those regulations. Survey critical business stakeholders, find out the players inside of the business who hold sway, what their intent is in the coming year in terms of business goals, and align those to information goals. Determine your governance efficacy. So if you have a great retention schedule and good policies to try and govern that, what is the level of organizational compliance against those policies? We often find that there's a gap between what the policies dictate, the ability for those policies to be enforced, and then what folks are actually doing with their information. A lot of times that can be quite reactive. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, weigh the risks. If you're thinking about adopting our little resolution for next year, there are certain risks involved there. It has to do with what information you have, where it's sitting, how you'll move it, how critical that information is to the business. And you certainly want to understand what the weight of those risks are. And not just those, but also the risks of liability that come with not being compliant, that come with not having efficient management processes for your information.
Yeah, and to add to that, Ryan, I think what you bring up here, and I really like this, starting off with this first tip here, is a lot of us are probably doing one or two of these things or several of these things already as a part of our responsibility for maintaining IT business admin or the infrastructure for the business to conduct its day-to-day activities. But an important thing here too, and I think you actually bring this up, and you said just a moment ago around, we might have a business rule, 7 years retention, or we're thinking about applying that. But then the difficulty of that next step, when we get into this in some of our future tips, how do we go about getting the business to comply with that, right? Because data stewardship and data responsibility is always a challenge when it's always an afterthought. When, as we're talking about here from a theme standpoint, it's no longer allowed to be an afterthought from a compliance standpoint. So bringing these things together, and just I really like what we have on the slide, because it's a call to action to actually, as an IT professional, to go talk to these parts of the business to get them to think about this, because there is actual urgency underpinning this now.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Okay. Tip number 2, being visionary starts with a vision. And we often deal with organizations, like Brian was alluding to the fact that there may be certain items on our previous slide or in your day-to-day work that is your responsibility, and you're a good advocate and a good custodian of those responsibilities. But does that necessarily roll up into a greater information governance vision? And as much as organizations have visions for their sales strategy and for their IT strategy and for the business as a whole, you also really need to have a strategy for your information and start to think about what is the vision that we're striving for in terms of this organization or this agency's information compliance, our information management, the way that we impart a culture of responsibility for information. These are the types of things that you want to aim for. You want to obviously envision outcomes that are specific and measurable and achievable, and time boxed, and try and be as output oriented as possible. And you want to build a business case, and that's a helpful process to go through if you're thinking about investing into a transformation of your information landscape, because obviously you'll have to justify the cost to certain stakeholders. And there are ways that you can build an ROI around these types of information governance implementations as well. You want to obtain support. You want to find the people who are most important to the success of this and get them to support the initiative, and consider and acquire a budget. And finally, start to create a blueprint, so that even before you start next year, you already know what the vision is, and you know what the blueprint is going to look like for this palace that we're trying to set up from an information perspective.
And this reminds me, I'm not sure, Ryan, if you've ever read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but I really like this, because this vision that we're talking about here really gets us to start with the beginning with the end in mind, right? Where do we want to be at the end of next year, right? This conversation in December of 2022. Can we think about these things not only from a lofty standpoint of I want to be able to have better governance, a better governance strategy and plan in place and be able to show results for it? It can even be simpler than that, right? I just want to know where my content is, and I want to be able to impose a 7-year, lifecycle management policy on that content. Believe it or not, even though that might be very specific, that goal can be substantial in mitigating an organizational risk when it comes to the content you're holding on to for that period of time. So just starting that process and helping people get comfortable with the concept that information can go away and be justifiably deleted after a period of time can be such a substantial game changer to how you guys organize your information and where you keep it, and then what applications you're supporting going forward. So think about those visions, in that regard as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone needs a North Star to navigate against, right?
Indeed.
Tip number 3, a goal without a plan is just a hope. And we often see this as well. Once you have a vision and you know where you want to go, and you need to figure out how to get there. And the process of doing that really involves planning. And this is not IT planning, which it may have been, a while back. What we're really talking about here is involving the whole business in creating an information roadmap and representing different parts of the business's requirements inside of that roadmap. And once you've started to look at what that roadmap might look like, you can start to do things like prioritizing low-hanging fruit or burning issues, and start to consider what required procurement vehicles you would need for the different milestones on that roadmap. And then finally start to orchestrate things like parallel IT projects and cloud migration efforts. Because if you have a vision for information governance inside of the organization, and you have some stakeholders who are supporting that vision, chances are that there's a whole bunch of other things happening next year as well, to do with cloud migration, to do with modernization of systems, to do with a whole whack of things. And we want to make sure that you have all of those things represented on the roadmap, so that all of these parallel efforts are set up for success.
I really like this slide, Ryan, because what we've done in these 3 tips so far, we went from visionary to starting to consider strategic planning, to now we're starting to get into some of these more tactical things on the day-to-day functions, right? Where this funnel effect is really starting to hone in this conversation over these next couple tips. So I think what we have here, like you said, prioritizing the burning issues, because most of us are not walking into an organization starting at 0. We have to look at what's out there today. But you also talk about something I think is really important here, and that is actually the symbiotic relationship between the IT team and the infrastructure we provide to the business, and how the business uses this. If you aren't sure of how the business is even using some of the platforms you enable for the business, got to start those conversations, right? It's got to be constant communication, and we used a word earlier between you and I, advocacy for these platforms and how they're using it to understand how these things are going to be going better going forward, because this responsibility is a two-way street, both between the business and their stewardship and our responsibility as IT professionals to enable the infrastructure to work well. So getting from just, you know, that hope of, oh, we really want people to use this platform going forward, to actually enabling them to do it and following through to the finalization of where that content is going, is why this slide I think is really powerful.
Yeah. Okay, tip number 4, lay a good foundation early on. Some thoughts around this and things from our own experience: it is more expensive to retrofit governance than to plan for it. And we often see a scenario where folks are migrating to the cloud, for instance, and they go, well, we'll just move everything across and we'll figure it out when we're there. And you know, that's not always the best way to approach things. In some instances, if your on-premise information was a bit of a mess, then that means that you got a bit of a mess in the cloud, and fixing it is not any easier just by virtue of the fact that you've moved it. And so taking something like cloud migration and saying, let's use this as an opportunity to really think about the way we want to govern our network and our ecosystem, and put the right policies in place up front. That's a lot better than, once folks are using it and information is moving around and there's a lot of movement on the system, to then say, well, let's try and see if we can retrofit the governance to that. Things that are important: cloud governance solutions on M365 can lower risk in IT admin. And so if folks are going, well, governance, I don't know, you know, that seems like an expense. Actually, the process of implementing governance is not as much of a grudge purchase as folks think it is, because it will lower risk, first of all, and it makes the entire environment a lot more manageable, and that means less IT admin hours in order to govern that landscape. And then there are different types of governance that you need to consider. If you're laying a foundation, you need to think about content governance, life cycle of information, how is information used, where is it situated, what are our policies around that. Teams governance, which throws the historical hierarchies of content in disarray, because folks want to move information around into different types of teams where they can collaborate on it as they manage this information through its life cycle. And then things like security governance as well. And bringing all of these together inside of a solid foundation really can set you up for success moving forward. And obviously on top of that, once you have all of this governance in place, you really want to be in a position to be able to have visibility of deltas, of anomalies, of trends, and be able to see in a dashboard format the health of that governance ecosystem inside of Microsoft 365.
And I think one thing to bring in here, Ryan, that we're talking about here, because when I talk to customers on my side, whether it's a 20-person organization, 2,000, 20,000, 200,000 person organization, is that there seems to always be a hyper focus for the IT team to focus on the bottom of this screen, the granular monitoring for insights, without thinking about the higher level here. But I'm sure if we all looked at it the way we all maintain our own personal data repositories, it can be very arbitrary, right? It can be very challenging to understand how one part of the business works versus another. So one thing to consider here is, again, start at the top and work your way to lower levels first when it comes to your governance strategy, no matter the size of your organization. But starting at the workspace level, you know, the team, the SharePoint site, the Exchange account, wherever you guys need to focus first, because that is a great place to at least start this business process, right? And so that's where this tip is really hitting home for me, is that a lot of people come in talking to us first at the item level, which is not necessarily sustainable up front if you don't have the organizational structure and strategy at a higher level, like the workspace or even your tenant, to get things right. So definitely something to consider when it comes to that good foundation early on.
Yeah, that's a really good thought. I mean, one of the things that we often run into is that the IT team will be responsible for authorizing the creation of a team's workspace, but they really don't have the context to make that determination. So what has to happen then is you have an IT person whose unfortunate task it is to try to track down the person who is actually in a position to talk about whether or not the provisioning of a team's workspace should be approved or shouldn't be approved. And really giving folks the power, or empowering people at the right level of the business to approve those types of things and go through those admin processes, again, is just worth the amount of effort it pulls out of the IT team in doing so.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Tip number 5, design your information ecosystem. There's a lot that goes into this design. So we're talking about laying a good foundation. The next step is having a space that you can work or live in effectively built on top of that foundation. And the things that go into these are things like informational taxonomies. If you can't tell the difference, and we've used this analogy on these talks before, tell the difference between a Word document that contains the lunch menu and a Word document that contains business critical intellectual property, you have a problem. Having a process of classifying information such that you can tell the difference between those two things, even though they're both Word documents, is certainly worth getting into as early in the information lifecycle as possible. This is something that is natural for records managers and compliance officers and information workers, but not so natural for folks who are in their day-to-day jobs. And setting up these types of informational taxonomies in such a way that as folks do their day-to-day jobs, they are working within a structure that is almost auto-classifying it. That's the secret sauce in getting these types of ecosystems working. And some other things, establish your file plans, classify your documents, and understand the difference between your business critical data, which normally on average only comprises 12% of the data that an organization manages and owns, and knowing what else is rot or redundant, obsolete, and trivial, or otherwise is dark data that resides on the network and on people's laptops that is undocumented in such a way.
And this is go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead. I was going to jump to the next point.
Okay, because I like the fact that we're the halfway point here with this tip, because this is where I actually see a lot of organizations struggle the most, where they've either had an historical attempt or attempts at these things like a file plan, like a managed metadata strategy, or being able to implement these things consistently and cohesively across the different business applications your organization may support. So don't feel overwhelmed by something like this, and that you're definitely not alone, that you may have struggled with this. But as you can see in the previous tips that we have brought together, now that we're at tip 5 and getting ready to move into the final tips here, that it's okay to take these things in pieces. It's okay to consider these things, but you definitely need some business input here. But then at the same time, putting these things together because they're fundamentally interrelated as a part of your information ecosystem.
Exactly. And this is a pervasive information designed to suit all business units.
That's right.
And there'll be differences business unit to business unit, and each one needs to design, their flavor of this. But certainly you want to have these structures well articulated as a baseline to drive the culture that you want to from an information governance perspective.
Yes, exactly.
Good stuff. I think we can move on.
Yeah.
Okay, then tip number 6, create a culture of good information custodianship. One of the things that folks, or something that we've realized in our consulting, is that technology can be fantastic, and we all work with fantastic technologies. M365 is a fantastic suite of technologies. AvePoint has a fantastic suite of technologies, but the best technologies in the world can be ineffective if the organization doesn't change its culture significantly, or appropriately, I should rather say, in order to work with them in a good manner. And this covers a lot of things. It means creating communities like a center of excellence or a community of practice where folks are able to give input into an evolving information ecosystem, and where there is the ability for thoughts and ideas and best practices to turn into policies and implementations that will suit the wider ecosystem, developing standard operating procedures, really thinking about change management. One of the things that IT projects do is that they implement the technology, and then as an afterthought, they try to manage the change that the technology will bring to the organization, where actually that change management has to start almost before the actual project starts. And the process of getting folks ready for the change, making them aware, ensuring that they are properly trained, that after the technology is rolled out, that adoption is driven, that it makes sense for them in their day-to-day lives, and that they have a sense of ownership for the technology because they had an input into how it is rolled out. All of these types of things are really crucial to making a success out of a good information governance implementation.
Yeah, and I really like this slide too, because the call to action here, like you said, is having that conversation with your end users and starting to focus on the people who are generating this information, right? Or helping them even think, like you said, it's a cultural change here for people to think about high value, mid value, and low value information that they're creating. You alluded earlier in our conversation to the lunch menu versus a business critical document about, like, business content continuation strategies. How do we help the business make sure that they signal if something is high, medium, and low, and make that a part of their regular business process when they're creating information and content? And these different segments here on this slide really hit home the different ways these avenues can be brought to the business with the different ways that people work. I can say, for example, I've always been a part of one form of a center of excellence or another that help break down some of those information silos with different parts of the business with people who are interested in these things. So I know that there's a lot on this slide, and we could probably talk about this for an hour, but just some touch points on how to communicate to the business going forward and reach out and get people thinking about these things.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. All right, then tip number 7, modernize, migrate, and go hybrid. There's a lot of buzz in the industry right now about cloud migrations and hybrid work environments and modernization of information and modernization of systems in order to become more SaaS oriented and it can be a little overwhelming, I guess. But there are certain stages that you can go through as part of a modernization or hybrid effort to alleviate a lot of this. And I'm sure that most of the folks on this call are somewhere in that journey. And some of the things that we're seeing as happening inside of this effort are, migrating identities and mail and files to the cloud. And this is happening in different stages. There may be file shares that are on the network, and for one reason or another, you can't just take them and migrate everything to the cloud. And staging this out as part of your roadmap and saying, well, we're going to take certain parts of the business and move that stuff to the cloud and go through an education process and help folks understand how to co-author and why cloud is so good for high availability and for resiliency as far as our information is concerned, and helps us protect our information, and kind of do that in bits and pieces. And it may seem messy, the process of doing this, because business units within the agency or the organization all have different priorities, but that's okay. I think the point is that to accept the fact that this period of time where folks have some cloud and some assets on premise that they're trying to sweat, and they're in the middle ground, this hybrid period is where all organizations really are. And so it's okay to migrate in stages. It's okay to consider updating legacy systems in bits and pieces. Consider connectivity on-premise workloads. So in other words, if you are going to if you have a records management system and it's not based on Microsoft 365 and you're going to continue to use it, and it's on-premise, consider the fact that if you move a certain business unit into Microsoft 365, that their ability to file into that system may be adversely affected, and that you may have to find some technology connector or a piece of technology which will allow them to continue to file to an on-premise records management system, even though they are now collaborating in the cloud.
Yeah, and one thing I like about this slide as well, because we recognize with tons of customers that they don't just use M365 or SharePoint as their collaboration platform. They might have custom apps or other app build-ons here that they still have to maintain. But the important question for myself as an IT professional is to have a conversation with the business: is this business critical? Is this going to continue to be business critical? And what do I need to do to continue to support this? Or what options do I have in another platform that provides other elements of flexibility, like what you're getting at here with how content management is now paramount for a lot of us when it comes to the compliance framework that we're talking about today. So I like this slide because it enforces that evolution conversation with the business to say, does this need to stay this way, or can we start changing these things to meet our new needs going forward, or how we've actually used this application or this customization that's keeping us in a hybrid world?
Yeah, and I think an addendum to that is that the landscape of record keeping versus, you know, collaboration is changing. These were very separate systems 5 years ago.
Yes.
And there was a process where you took the mess of collaboration and you moved it into record keeping. And you know, archivists who work inside of record keeping have a certain set of skills and an ethos about information, and generally the collaboration space didn't share that. And what we're finding now is that, and it's perhaps an opportunity as much as it is a collision, that the folks who are responsible for that information, their world, which was records management, is starting to expand, and their responsibility is starting to travel down that collaboration piece of the document lifecycle. We want to try and be due diligent from the beginning, from the outset of creating information. We want to classify it early on. We want folks who care about the value of information and understand the regulation around it to have a say in the way that these collaboration spaces are created. And likewise, the folks who are doing the collaborating, we want them to become better custodians of information in this process. And so this is perhaps a really exciting thing that's happening as these two worlds collide. Okay, next tip, I think maybe. Tip number 8, protect your information. I think that this goes without saying. There are lots of ways to do this. We've given some examples here, but essentially, this is no longer a luxury. You really need to take every opportunity that you can to protect your information in all the different ways that are available, whether that is, you know, considering a cloud archiving solution or backing up your data appropriately. And in a lot of cases, archiving and backup and these types of things are also a cost consideration. And again, the costs involved with those types of systems are a lot easier to manage if you're able to classify your information in such a way that you know that you know, this is what we're paying for to back up information that might be redundant, obsolete, or trivial, or archive that information, rather than going, well, we can't classify our information, so we're painting everything with the same brush. And as a result of that, we're paying storage costs for our business critical data and the same storage cost for information that we may not need or ever reuse. And at the same time, you know, spending a lot of money protecting information that is perhaps not business critical. Things like data loss prevention, stop the information from leaving your ecosystem, multi-factor authentication to really protect to ensure the identities of folks who are interacting in that ecosystem, and then carefully considered sharing permissions and sharing life cycles. You know, it wasn't too long ago that IT departments would say, well, our policy is that we don't allow guest accounts on the network, and we don't allow collaboration with partners and vendors and customers. And I think those days are coming to an end, because the fact of the matter is that, especially in today's culture of remote work and distributed information and distributed organizational structures, that folks really expect to be able to collaborate in an efficient manner with folks who are outside the organization. And in many cases, this has actually become a necessity. And so you really need to build your policies around sharing and managing of information lifecycle in such a way that you enable that sharing without compromising your security.
Absolutely, and I'll just hit on one thing real quick here, because I know we're coming up on the end of the hour here. I mean, that went by very quickly. Multi-factor authentication and conditional access and the shared permissions aren't just about end users, right? Let's talk about the applications that are supporting you, like a third-party app or something that's cloud hosted that also meets your security requirements, right? That works within the secure app framework that that solution providers like Microsoft and Azure provide, right? It shouldn't just be about your end users. It's about also how the apps communicate with each other and ensure that security framework up front, because the last thing you want is a contagion situation where you have a failure in one location that somehow impacts others, because a service account that MFA enabled is the only connector that enables these apps to communicate, right? So it's not just about end users, it's also about how apps communicate with each other and leverage that security framework going forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's a real knife edge, you know, enabling friction-free productivity and efficient collaboration without ever compromising your security or your information governance.
For sure.
Okay, tip number 9, implement information compliance. Seems simple enough. There are a lot of things that go into this, though, reaching a level of compliance. Things like compliance attestation and processes. How do we gather evidence to show that we are compliant? Are we measuring that on a continuous basis? Monitor and measure internal records compliance. So here are our policies. Like Brian said earlier, we have a retention rule that says that certain types of documents need to be kept for 7 years. Are we able to measure whether or not the business is compliant with that in all of the different business units? Align your physical and electronic compliance, and this is front and center in the coming year with the changes in policy from NARA. Consider a long-term preservation solution. So if you have to store information for 30 years, for instance, consider that the formats that you're storing them in may no longer be consumable in 30 years' time, and build a preservation solution that will allow you to cater for those types of eventualities. And then finally, modernize your e-discovery for holes in data subject requests. This can become a real time suck for folks. These types of data holds and subject requests and everything like that, they're becoming more prolific and becoming efficient at turning these things around in a really good manner is really worthwhile for the organization. We often deal with folks who are looking at e-discovery, on the Microsoft 365 platform, and will say that they find it very inefficient, that the types of results that they're expecting includes documents that should be included or that shouldn't be included, or excludes things that should be included. And in a lot of cases that boils down to that classification tier that we spoke about. I think it was tip number 5. If your documents are well classified and they are in locations that make sense for the taxonomies that you've set up, then those types of e-discovery requests become very easy to service. Whereas if you're relying on something like, as wonderful as it is, artificial intelligence to automatically pick up and classify information just based on the type of words that are used inside those documents, you're always going to be getting a percentage of accuracy there. And you really want to do as much as you can to enable those types of processes by having the right information in structures in place right from the outset.
Yeah, and I think what you hit on here, Ryan, that I really like is that, as you just brought up with that AI example, it's an iterative conversation, right? These things are not set and forget it. It's a continuous conversation that should always be one of those things you are always talking to the business about, or checking and confirming as the targets and requirements move, as you mentioned with the legal jurisprudence that's coming out about these compliance frameworks, that we will have to adjust accordingly and be flexible enough to change with how these interpretations go forward. But at the same time, as the information changes, or as, for example, AI becomes better at this, we're going to think about how to calibrate that appropriately for the business and what we interpret that we need for the compliance framework.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't predict what the weather of compliance holds for us, but we can build our house strong enough that the walls can withstand whatever you can throw at us.
You got it. I like that.
And then tip number 10, look to the future. We were just talking about AI, and this is really a buzzword, and a lot of folks are trying to make these things do more than they really can. But in a situation where you followed all of the other tips and you have really well classified information that is discoverable and structured in such a way that it is usable by systems that have machine learning or artificial intelligence intent, you can really get a lot out of these types of systems. You can start to do auto classification of information, and that really helps you if you're looking at data loss prevention or sensitivity or these types of things. You can use machine learning to identify trends and anomalies within the business and really arm business stakeholders to make good decisions based on the fact that they're picking up trends and anomalies that a human analyst would never find. And you can use bots to assist with governance and admin. Based on good, well-structured information, bots can sometimes actually facilitate a conversation with an admin intent quite well. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think AppPoint actually has a bot of that type that works on the backup solution, where folks can interact with a bot rather than a human in order to get their backups or to restore certain information. Those are the types of things that well-structured information enable. And then automated provisioning of lifecycle events wherever they're happening inside of your tenant. So a project ends somewhere within your M365 environment, and a whole lot of wheels turn throughout that environment to ensure that all of the information is properly consolidated, moves into a record system, whatever is appropriate for the agency or organization in question.
Right.
And then finally, pervasive information workflows. So the better your information is structured, the better you can build workflows that make people more productive in their day-to-day work.
And just to tie this all together, like what you've provided over the last 10 tips, Ryan, and in our conversations, right? Visionary, or that high level, then strategic, what do we want to do with these applications? Then the tactical, how do we talk to our business users about this? Or even how do we help fill in some of these gaps with either out of the box technology or customizations that we need to meet our business needs, right? This all comes together as we continue to look forward, because this conversation is rapidly evolving. Right? Even though we are in IT and we're always looking for these things as a part of our responsibility for the applications we provide to the business, it's always a good moment to reflect here, and especially in this final tip, to think about how these things will play out at these levels and how we can talk to the business and advocate for these things going forward, so that way that we're not caught with any surprises or last minute changes that change our whole strategy for this next year.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better. Okay, and then as always, with these discussions, for any of the listeners who found this of value, we are delighted to offer a free workshop at no obligation. It is 4 hours worth of workshopping led by cloud architect and information governance experts to help you with those first stages that we outlined in the first few tips. Things like a pre-workshop survey, informational analysis, a look at the records management maturity, a whole whack of things that can set you up to really turn 2020 into a blockbuster year from an information governance perspective.
Yep, and we'll be sending some additional information out about the workshops with the recording. All of that stuff will be out around this time tomorrow. But in the meantime, that's my personal email there. Please reach out if you're interested, and we'll go ahead and get one on the books for you.
Good stuff. Okay, so that leaves us. Yeah, sorry, Maggie, over to you.
We don't have a whole lot of time for Q&A, but thank you so much to everybody for popping in. We really appreciate you sharing your a little bit of your day with us. Everybody have a wonderful and safe holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Indeed. See you in 2022.
Yep.